very pleased to be able to discuss this work, which took me 8 years because, as you could notice, it had nothing to do with my field of speciality, which is still immigration policy, citizenship, the status of religion and comparative perspective. But for an historian, when it happens that you found this treasury, which is an unknown manuscript of Sigmund Freud, I stopped doing everything and I started working very hard, first of all, to understand the Treaty of Versailles. And the first thing I discovered is that I had not very much understood the Treaty of Versailles. And I will give you two facts that maybe you don't really get. I didn't get it before. The first, I don't know if you have ever heard of the Treaty of Guarantee. I never heard of it until so you have heard, of course, of the League of Nations that was created and preceded the UN. But you had also a treaty, a military treaty, that preceded NATO. And that was the Treaty of Guarantee that was offered by President Wilson and Prime Minister Lloyd George to Premier Clemenceau as a guarantee of military intervention of the US and of England in case of German aggression against France, and was signed the same day than the Treaty of Versailles by the three leaders of the three Western countries. And for the French, it was the major issue of the negotiation, to get the security. For the Brits, it was to get the navy and the colonies of Germany and the high reparation. And for the President of the United States, it was to get the League of Nations, to become the leader of the world through this instrument he campaigned and negotiated for. The second thing I really didn't know until I checked and double-checked and even triple-checked, because my publisher said, can you be more precise, when I had finished the book, it is that at the end of the battle Wilson has with the Senate in the end of the year 1919, and then the beginning of the year 1920, it is Wilson who ordered the Democratic senators to vote against the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. He has come to negotiate in Paris, living in Paris for 6 months of his life and of his presidency. And as this very important historian, Thomas Weil, who was professor at Stanford, he wrote on Woodrow Wilson and the Great Beat Trial, because in 1945 he wrote this book saying Wilson created a baby and then killed his own baby. And he ordered 2 members of his cabinet to go on the lobby of the Senate to make sure that the treaty was not ratified, because he didn't want the Republican reservation. And what was the major opposition he had? He said one of the reservations was saying, in case of declaration of war within the system of the League, the representative of the US has to respect the US Constitution and get approval of Congress. It is that provision that he refused to support, and that made a lot of people among his advisors, within his cabinet, among the Washington journalists, to think he had become mad. And the term madness or unbalanced was very currently used at that moment in the press and among Americans who were following. If you look at the New York Times headlines every day, it was completely a total mess, something that memory of has been lost. So, in fact, Wilson's personality has attracted the question mark of many of his cabinet. For example, the Secretary of State wrote as the mentality of Woodrow Wilson. Has Wilson a feminist mind? And it was he wrote, and everybody was asking questions. What is this person working? What is his character? How does it? And one among his advisor was William Bullitt, who was a young journalist speaking fluently French and German, who was sent by his Philadelphia newspaper to report from the Central Empire in the year 1916, and whose report was so well informed that he was hired by the State Department to head the enemy bureau after the declaration of war of April 1917. And he would deliver directly to Wilson, because at that time the State Department is across the White House. So he would meet Wilson personally, deliver his memo, and noticed at some, I don't want to elaborate, we can go, at some point how Wilson was not thinking very strategically when he had to take decision under the request of his new ally, the French, the German, the French, the English, and the Japanese. Then he goes with Wilson on the same boat to the Paris negotiation. He is assigned to the relation with the Socialists and the Bolshevik Party. He attended the International Socialist meeting of Bern of February 1919, and because of his success at this conference, he is sent to have a secret mission to visit and negotiate with Lenin in March 1919, a truce between the forces involved in the civil war of Russia, under certain conditions that are set by Colonel House, who was the advisor of Wilson, and Lloyd George. And he not only got the condition he was assigned, but he got more, and he was 26, he came back to Paris, and Wilson doesn't dare meet him. And Lenin has put a deadline to this proposal of a deal, which was April 10, and then the deadline passes, the deal is done, and then when he saw the first draft of the treaty, he decided to resign from the American delegation to negotiate the peace and to make his resignation letter public. So he's become a public figure, the first American public figure in opposition to the treaty. And then he's called on a testimony in the US Senate by the Republican in September 1919, where he told his story of his mission to Moscow. But in addition, he said that in a private meeting, Secretary of State Lansing has told him that if he was a senator, he would vote against the treaty. So that helped the Republican to derail the process of ratification. But in addition to the Keynes book, which was published in December of the following weeks, the derailment, as I just mentioned, came from Wilson himself. And in fact, Bullitt did not anticipate, I don't think he wanted this derailment really, he wanted to show an opposition, but he was shocked by the result. He came back to a private life. He divorced from his first wife, who could not have a baby, and married the widow of John Reed, famous journalist Louise Bryant. And he wrote a novel that was very successful about the declining upper class of Philadelphia. But then he's obsessed by the failure of American president and diplomacy in Paris, and he wrote a play on Wilson's personality that is quite remarkable, that got a very big support by the Guild of New York, of Broadway, but could not find a producer in Broadway. But to make his play, I would say, well done, he decided to visit Freud and to start a psychoanalysis with him. I'm sure that during the session where he dealt with his personal problem, they spoke about Wilson, and the play was completed only a few weeks after the end of his psychoanalysis. The play is rejected, and 3 years later, he comes back with a new project and visit Freud with a project of a book on diplomacy that will emphasize the role of psychology in fact, he had a theory, he wrote something, the fate of mankind is determined over millions of years by geography, over hundreds of years by demography, over tens of years by economics, and year over year by psychology. Which is quite a theory. And he wanted to apply this theory to the main figure of the treaty, and he offered Freud the opportunity to write a piece on Wilson, because Freud has told him, I want to write something on Wilson. And Freud said, well, I cannot if you don't provide me facts and evidences. And then if you provide me enough facts and evidences, we will write together. And the summer of 1930, Bullitt goes back to the US, and here you can see his talent of journalist and interviewer. He managed, not only, of course, to read all the already published documents, but to get access to testimonies of the most intimate advisor of Wilson. And Wilson has a particular personality in the way that he would talk to his intimate friends and collaborators as you talk to a psychoanalyst. He will share what his nightmare, his feelings, his hatreds, his loves, his passion, in letters and also in private conversation. And so Bullitt had an incredible number of fascinating testimony from Wilson's secretary, chief of staff, but mainly his doctor, who was his last friend at the end of his life, Dr. Grayson, and his biographer, who wrote a very classical biography. It was Baker, Ray Baker, but had much more in his head than what he wrote, a much more interesting interpretation he shared with Bullitt. And Freud and Bullitt, in their first introduction draft, thanked especially Baker, but they cut that. I think he participated to the creation of the theory they wrote about Wilson. One very important document Bullitt got was, at that time, secret diary of Colonel House. Every day, House will dictate the event of the day and his discussion with the president. And in this 2,000-page diary, he finds some jewels. And the main jewels was that when he was until the mid-term of his second term, Wilson had a lot of problem, a lot of night without sleep or nightmare because of what happened to him in Princeton. And so there is a chapter in my book which is called The Princeton Nightmares. And so he could not recover. He could not recover until the last day of his life. He was more obsessed with his failure in Princeton than his failure to bring the peace to the world in some way. So what happened to him in Princeton? So he was a student, he was a professor, and he was a president of Princeton. And the failure are about his presidency. So he started very well, he was a reformer. He brought the Oxford system of tutoring and broke with a classical teaching class. But then he wanted to do other reform, and it didn't work. And here was the first problem that, and it is mentioned by Ray Baker in his testimony to Bullitt. Wilson had to have a woman at home and one much loved friend, and that could be hard as steel to any man outside that circle. So a woman at home, he had a woman at home. He had a first wife, a second wife. A few months after the first wife died, he found a second wife. But a much loved friend, that is something people don't know. And that was key for his capacity to be living, in fact, to have a profession. And in Princeton, he became very friend with a colleague, which is called Heben, who would become president of Princeton. And he was a professor of theology, and they would spend days. The two couples would meet. He would meet. And on the issue of the reform of the dining club, which was the main issue, Heben told him he disagreed, and he said, "Okay, I love you. We'll never." But the day of the faculty meeting, when Heben took the floor and said, "I disagree," he had like a hurt attack, not physical but psychological. He collapsed psychologically, completely. He had to leave to recover in the Barbade. He wrote to friends, "I don't recover from what happened. I don't recover from what happened." It was an absolute catastrophe. The second feature of his presidency is that, as much as he needed a true love friends, he had a stark enemy, and the enemy was the dean of the graduate school, and who they didn't have a graduate school, and they had to have it, and the dean would find financial support from a Procter company, and he refused the grant, and he started organizing a campaign again. He lied to his board to the point that he was about to be fired, and he campaigned outside Princeton all across the country against his board until he was almost fired, and he jumped to democratic politics in New Jersey before being fired. So what is very interesting for Bullitt and Freud is that these two features, the love friends and the stark enemy, is exactly what you find in the picture of his president in the negotiation of the peace treaty. He had this incredible friendship with Colonel House that nobody has ever seen a president with this kind of intimate advisor to whom he tells, "You are me. I don't need to tell you anything. You know what I think. You know everything of me, etc." Until he broke with him at the worst moments of the Conference of Peace, which was in March 1990. And then the stark enemy is Cabot Lodge. Cabot Lodge was an academic who published as an editor of a political science journal the first Wilson academic article. He is quoted 3 times in his most famous book, Congressional Government. So he liked very much, he respected Cabot Lodge, until when Cabot Lodge made a speech criticizing Wilson after his reaction to the Lusitania sinking. So I'll come back to that later. So but at that point he said he ordered all the members of his cabinet not to attend any meeting, any even religious event, like a mass, where Cabot Lodge is present. And he would say later, "I will never sign a document, the same document than Cabot Lodge." Or if you had a reservation from the Senate, you would have something signed by I suppose the majority leader or whatever, recording the vote of the Senate, or something would have happened that the Cabot Lodge would have been part of the ratification of the treaty. So this recurring feature, which in psychoanalysis there's often report neuroses that repeat, because Wilson was saying, "I feel that what happened to me in Princeton will come back and it's exactly what happened. He was fearing, and it came back. So what did Freud and Bullitt at that stage thought? They thought he had a fixation to his father, and there is a testimony of his doctor that is very interesting, that says that, let me find it, because Wilson worshipped his father as I have never seen any man worship any other. When he got on his knees each night to pray to God, he felt sure that if his father approved of what he had done that day, everything would be all right with God. That was even when he was in Paris negotiating as the President of the United States. He was permanently checking that whatever he was doing, his father would approve. So this relation of obedience to the father for a Freudian shows to a father that was reported as very authoritarian, very imposing on Wilson when he was a kid, etc., etc., cannot cannot have provoked or resisted or camouflage an anger or will of revolt that never have been expressed. And for them, it was expressed toward representative of the father, inconsciently. So Dean West in Princeton and Cabot Lodge in Congress. Then you had this attachment to the father meant that he had, even if he had brothers and sisters, he wanted to have his father for himself. So he would have a young brother he would protect officially, like he would have young, loved friends. But when these friends wanted to be equal or speak for themselves, then it was a break, because he could not stand. When he was at the high school, he was null in sport, but he would organize a society of the high schoolers sport association. He would create the statutes, the convent, etc. He was always leading by writing the regulation of the debate association everywhere at Princeton, etc., etc. So that was one of some of the things they agreed on. They disagreed on a few things. One thing where I think Bullitt was right. One day, Wilson wrote to his father. He was a student at Princeton. Dad, I've discovered I have a mind. After reading an article on Gladstone, where the oratory talent of Gladstone was emphasized, and his capacity with this talent to run the House of Commons. And for Freud, it was something linked to masturbation, etc., or guilt. And for Bullitt, who was a Lacanian before Lacan in some way, he said, you know, language counts here. He discovered he could be a minister without being the minister that his father wanted him to be, because his father wanted him to be a minister of the church, and he would be a prime minister. And one of his first acts as President of the United States is to deliver the State of the Union address in person, orally, in front of Congress, when, since Jefferson, the State of the Union has been delivered by a letter, by printed text. So he went to Congress like a prime minister. And then when he became president of Princeton, he said, I feel like a prime minister. So he had a sublimation. It was a way of obeying the father, but competing with him and winning his own place in the world so that is, I think, very interesting. So at that stage, let me say that the book is finished. It's 1932, ready to be published when Bullitt is called by Roosevelt to become one of his main diplomats. I will shift all that part because we have to go to the end. One point, he's becoming the first ambassador, and he negotiated the recognition of the Soviet Union by the United States. He's the first ambassador. He created the embassy in Moscow, and then he discovers the horror of Stalinism. And at that point, he theorized the Soviet communists. He says it's like a religion, with the head of the church is in Moscow. They promise the paradise if the party wins the power, and they want to conquer the world. And from that point, he became the most radical anti-communist diplomat in the State Department, thinking that permanently. He has opposed, because when he's in Paris from 36 to 40, he understands the main enemy has become Nazism. But when back to Washington and put aside by Roosevelt allied with Stalin, he agreed with that, but he says you should be very careful, because the fate of Eastern Europe and China will be awful under another fascism, which will be the communist fascism, in addition to the fate of Soviet Union. And he doesn't agree with the last years of Roosevelt. He joined the Free French Army, and then he became a kind of independent diplomat for fighting communism, supporting the Republican against Roosevelt because they are more aggressive toward China, or supporting of Chiang Kai-shek. He became an advisor of Chiang Kai-shek when he exiled to Formosa, and he became the Kissinger of Nixon before Kissinger, because he is the main advisor of Nixon for foreign affairs from 48 to 64. Then, after the defeat of Nixon in 1960 and the death of Mrs. Wilson in 1962, he thinks about publishing the book. But when I discovered, as Jennifer mentioned, the manuscript and I compared it to the book published, it was not the same book. He had revised, edited, cut 300 passages of the original manuscript. What did he cut? He cut, first of all, something I will make a quotation of. When he came back from a conversation with work with Freud on November 1st, he wrote on the letterhead of the hotel where he was staying, he recorded the following dialogue, opening with Freud. You and I know that Wilson was a passive homosexual, but we won't dare say it. I said, certainly, we'll say it, but subtly. Freud answered, that's the equivalent of not saying it at all. So finally, they wrote it 12 times in the book. You have the mention of passive homosexuality of Wilson, illustrated by his relation to his chief of staff, with whom he's sleeping in the same bed when he was campaigning in New Jersey. But the most interesting quotation of Dudley Malone, that Wilson one day told him, when I feel badly, sore and gloomy, and everything seems wrong, then I know that my mother's character is uppermost in me. But when life seems gay and fine and splendid, then I know the part of my father which is in me in the ascendance. So in ascendance, a father in the ascendance, somebody who is doing a little. So you had other, and of course the psychological investment toward his best friend. The guy who presented the motion against his plan on the dining club, he nominated him as ambassador to Netherlands. What he didn't like, it was the fact that his friend took the floor. And that's my, I will come back on that. The second point, why did they suppress, is something Bullitt, I think, created, is that after identifying himself to the Prime Minister Gladstone, when he was in the international stage, Wilson identified himself with the Christ. Or even more than that, with God the Father, or a better son than the Christ. Because one day in a meeting, Lloyd George reported in his memoir that Wilson said, the Christ did well in the principle, but the implementation didn't work very well. So I'm here to correct him and Lloyd George say, we all look around, and I look at Clemenceau as an atheist, his black eyes, etc. But all of us have been raised as Christian, and everybody give the testimony that they felt they had the Christ in the room, when he was negotiating. And Bullitt has an incredible theory that the Christ is the symbol of the perfection of bisexuality as a structure of personality, because being totally passive to his father, he becomes God himself. So, in fact, they wrote in the manuscript, homosexual sublimation of the homosexual part of most of us brings the world to fraternity, because they emphasize the high benefits of this bisexual dimension of in the manuscript. All that has been cut, and so all that has been cut. Why? It's not that Bullitt disagree. It is that in the context of the Cold War, he thought that any challenge to Christianity, to the Christ, an interpretation that could be used by the Soviet in the middle of the 60s, against the United States, against against the President of the United States, whatever, could be bad for the fate of the world. And he didn't want to help any critic of Wilson, of the United States, even if he had this opinion on Wilson. So he suppressed that, but he didn't destroy the manuscript, and now the manuscript is available. So I wanted to add two things to their analysis. First of all, they didn't know, because that has been brought by some other historian, that Wilson's father was not only authoritarian, he was pervert. He was humiliating his son publicly in family meetings. And what is very noticeable is that what Wilson doesn't accept, it's not the critics of his friend, it is the humiliating critics, when they are done in public and where they are where he felt hurt. For example, this Malone, with whom he has the same bed, he loved him, really, he loved him. Malone broke with him because he told him he has not respected his promise to give suffrage to women. Malone was married with one of the women heading the suffrage movement. He couldn't sleep. Wilson said, I couldn't sleep last night because of this conversation. I love him. But he never broke with him. He never felt any feeling of treason or whatever, something he felt towards Heben because he took the floor, and toward House because he had feedback that House has made laugh of him and his bad talent of negotiating. So that is one important thing. And the second thing I want to emphasize, which may bring me to my conclusion, is that Freud and Bullitt misses the next love friends Wilson made after he broke with Colonel House. And that has a meaning it will permit to connect Wilson to the current situation of our world. In fact, Wilson I wouldn't say in love, but became infatuated with General Smuts, the delegate of South Africa in the British delegation. He wrote the League of Nations convent with Smuts. He gave Smuts the German colonies. He had refused to the Prime Minister of Australia and the Prime Minister of England. And then the main thing was the high reparation that British wanted to distribute them to its dominion. Well, Lloyd George told him, if you don't give me this reparation, I'll have to resign. He said, okay, that's a magnificent way of leaving power on principle. 3 days later, after Smuts went to him, he left, he gave everything. And then he had a kind of psychological breakdown because it was a treason toward his high father's requested high purpose for the treaty, but his attraction and his will to please Smuts took control of his decision. And the last interview he gave before he died, he said, the only man I respect in the world is General Smuts, etc., etc. So now let me conclude. It's very difficult to understand before we elect our leaders that they are unbalanced or mad or whatever. Nevertheless, there are some clues. And in Wilson there was one type of clue that we can find again in the current politics of the United States or France. It is the will to violate the Constitution. So for Wilson, it was incredible because he was a student and a professor of the Constitution. He was one of the first professors of government. And in March 1919 in Paris, he says, let's have a meeting of the League of Nations without having the ratification of the... He had to have all the secretary of his legal advisors. You cannot have a meeting of the League of Nations without... It's a treaty. You have to go through approval of the Senate. Okay. Then in November 1919, he drafted a letter to be sent to 56 senators, asking them to resign immediately from their position. And there will be by-election in their states. And if they win, he will resign, the vice president will resign, and he will have nominated a secretary of state or who would be the next on the list to become president of the United States, a Republican. I mean, you know better than me. Each state has its own rule. What happens when the senator resigns? Sometimes it's a by-election. Rarely, it's often the governor who name a temporary senator. So that was and then the last thing he did. Why did he rejected the reservation of the Republican? He had accepted a kind of, and it's very well shown in this book, the reservation he has accepted from the Democrats were almost the same. So what was the issue? Not signing with Cabot Lodge? Of course it's possible, but I have another hypothesis. It is that all over the negotiation, Wilson repeats that the only place he feels at home in the world, it is in the South. He tells the French translator at the conference that he always felt solidarity with Alsace-Lorraine because he was from Virginia, and Virginia was an occupied territory by the North, and he understands what it is to be occupied by a foreign power. Then when he died, he had told his wife that despite having a place for a tomb in a Princeton cemetery, he didn't want to be buried in Princeton because he had so bad memory of the town. But he didn't want to be buried in Arlington because he thought the land has been unfairly confiscated from General Lee estate. And so it's why he's buried at the Washington Cathedral. But I would say that he was also with the League of Nations without, I think the Republican reservation was bringing back to the US Constitution, which was for him in some way the constitution of the victorious North. And with his friend, the defeated general of the Boers of South Africa, he had created a league of the white leaders that would be ruling the world without any more the constraints of their equalitarian, potentially egalitarian national constitution. And he didn't want to be brought back to the northern US Constitution by this reservation. So here there is a link, you know, you have Mr. Trump and his Elon Musk, like this, you have this friendship that is, that resemble the friendship between Wilson and Smuts. I'm not going to do more. It's up to you to tell me if I am crazy. But I'm stopping here, and I really thank you for your attention.
So I'll come join you. I'll ask a couple of questions just by way of kicking off the discussion. So your title, The Madman in the White House, really brings out, I mean, it both brings out connections. It's a title that resonates a lot in the current context, but it raises the question of whether there's always a madman in the White House, or to what degree you're suggesting a kind of distinctive pathology on the part of Wilson. So you started by saying Wilson provided a huge amount of data, in a sense. You know, all of these confessional interchanges with House that House put into his diary. We know a lot about Wilson's dreams and nightmares and emotions and passions, a lot more than we know maybe about many presidents. If we knew that much about every president, would we think they're all madmen in the White House? Or is there some distinctive pathology about Wilson? And part of the reason that I ask this is because the negotiations to create the Versailles Treaty and also then to generate the Senate ratification were so delicate and complex, and there were so many opposing parties, that you wouldn't have to be a deeply pathological person traumatized by your authoritarian father's humiliation of you to flub it. I mean, there are lots of ways in which those negotiations could have gone wrong. So to what degree do you want to emphasize psychological debility a kind of, of a very distinctive sort as the root cause of this series of failures. Versus, I mean, the point that you ended on at the very end, which is a fascinating point, I think, about his kind of joint project with Smuts to transcend the U.S. Constitution by creating a global constitution that kind of advances the cause of white Christian entities.
Yeah.
That could go a long way toward the explanation. We wouldn't have to resort to claims about.
So I think it's so in the book there is a lot about Roosevelt because there is a lot about the Bullitt.
Mm-hmm.
And you see also Roosevelt intimately with, because Bullitt was writing some of his speeches, having really a very good relation with him for at least 4 or 5 years. And what is remarkable is that, and I don't think I say we, you do it, but we think that enough that both Roosevelt and Churchill, who saved the free world, Second World War, were in Paris in 1919. They knew everything that has happened, especially Churchill. He wrote about Wilson madness in some way in his memoir of the first. He said he wanted the French and the German to make love after 4 years, and he could not sit at the same table than the Republican, his own compatriots. So he had noticed his balanced personality. And Roosevelt had noticed also. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was in Paris, lower position than Churchill, who was in the main negotiation committees. But for example, Roosevelt put 2 Republicans in his cabinet in May 1940, something Wilson didn't want. After losing the midterm election of 1918, having still Theodore Roosevelt alive, everybody was advising him to bring a top Republican in the delegation of the negotiation in Paris, because he would need the. So here you have a kind of. I agree with you that it was difficult, but I don't think it was so difficult. And here there is a very important point I would like to make. In 1919, in the American Senate, you have perhaps 2 isolationist senators. 95% of the Senate want a coalition. The Republicans want, like Theodore Roosevelt, they want to keep the alliance with France and the UK. The Treaty of Guarantee is totally fine for the Republican, for the most. And so this presentation of American diplomacy being split between the liberals on one side, internationalists, and the isolationists is wrong. You had the one who wanted the Atlantic Alliance and who were opposed to a world organization in which the US could go everywhere. That was the difference. But there was nobody, among the Senate who would say we have to keep strictly the Monroe Doctrine, not being. They knew the world has changed, that with new aircraft and you could reach the American coast easily. You needed alliance, etc. So I think it was not so difficult in the climate of the victory. It was not so difficult to have a treaty. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is, I think you have a point. Today there is a book that is published in France, written by a colleague, a sociologist, about our French president, Emmanuel Macron. It's called The Pervert Thought in Power. And it's about the psychological portrait, I would say, of President Macron. And the book is relying mostly on the theory and the work of a French psychoanalyst who is not known in the US. I don't think has been ever translated. And he's the creator, the inventor of the concept of narcissist pervert. His name is Racamier. And Racamier said, a good institution is the one where the perversion of character does not pay off. I think it works very well, even in our university institution, everywhere. Everywhere. I think it's a very remarkable analysis. And thinking about that while preparing my talk today, I think that it's very difficult because the perverse narcissists are very seductive. They're using the words you want to, that are adapted to what you want to hear, etc. Until they become active and you feel the destruction process, etc. And the issue is, do we have means to eject them or to prevent their and what is, I think, amazing in the United States, and I would think, it is that after what happened on January 6th, you can have the man who has organized it still running, and that is something very extraordinary. That there is no, it's very difficult. So that's my first remark. And the second remark is that I think the presidential system, and that is what Bullitt thought, that the parliamentary system is better. Because, for example, in the United Kingdom, the people who were seduced by Boris Johnson, etc., for the Brexit, etc., it took them years to understand, but when it was understood, they ejected him in few weeks because of the parliamentary system. Something we cannot do easily in a presidential system. So, in fact, in the book he was preparing on diplomacy, Bullitt would emphasize the necessary for the US to move towards the parliamentary system. I mean, it's so difficult to do that because the people love to vote for the presidential election, etc. But I agree with you. I think when we are all dependent on one person, we have to choose every 4 or 5 years. It's become, we don't talk anymore about project, about program. We are, if he or she, and who can be the next, etc. It's terrible. It is paralyzing the mind, the spirit of democracy, etc. So I think, yes, I agree. I didn't agree on some details, but I agree on the main comment you were making.
Not only that, but we put them through such torture that you would have to, I think
I
a number
agree.
of Americans think that you have to be an unbalanced person to want to go through that.
Yeah, it's true, it's true.
How are we doing for time? We should open it up to questions. I guess the one other question that I'd like to ask, which you didn't emphasize, is just what this might tell us about Freud that we don't otherwise know about Freud. I think, the book was somewhat reviled, or maybe very reviled, by the psychoanalytic community
by the daughter of because what happened, that I had to learn. So Freud is using his first frame against the second one, because the first frame is about inconscious, subconscious, and conscience. And the second frame is the superego, the ego and the id. Mm-hmm. And all the American school have moved with Anna Freud and Erikson towards the ego psychology. And suddenly the dead father come back and say, well, you can do a biography, something that was the field of Erikson, with the first frame. So they challenged the fact that their father had. So now with my discovery, they cannot challenge anything. And because I have the manuscript that has been revised by Anna Freud, and her revision has been rejected by Bullitt, because he said, I have worked with her father, and her father never told me that I had to go through her revision or something. And but what, I don't know, you have read the book. I think what I discover a Freud very easy to work with somebody who is not a professional psychoanalyst. Mm-hmm. So probably doesn't feel challenged in.
Yeah, his openness to the project
very
itself
openness and the way he accepted the Bullitt alternative interpretation and discussion on the death drive, etc. I think it shows. I mean, I've been through all the archives I could. It shows somebody who was quite agreeable.
Flexible.
Yeah,
Mm.
I don't know how you
Yeah,
feel.
I agree.
So it was quite impressive for that.
Let's open it up if there are questions in the audience.
What role did
Sorry,
those
we're going to
days-
pass the mic so that
what role in those days did those internationalist groups, you know, Club of Rome, who else would have been there? Bilderberg was probably around in those days. Yeah, influenced on him.
On which, no, it didn't exist at that time.
Wilson.
No, I mean,
Were they behind the League of Nations and that stuff?
you had a mobilization behind the League of Nations, but the League of Nations idea came from the British, from Grey, the secretary, the foreign secretary. And very smartly, because Colonel House was willing to have the US involved in the war on the side of the French and the British, but Wilson was very reluctant. The Republicans wanted it. And so he sold to Wilson the idea that he would be, if he would be involved in the war, he would be organizing the peace. And then the project would be to end wars. That will be the war that will end all wars, and he will be the one who will do that. So he was so excited by that project. He was extremely excited to be the new. That's what. No. It was not an issue. No, it was not an issue of money. He had no money. He was not interested by money at all. He was very poor. He has no property. When he joined the White House, he had to buy. He has not. No. It was not. There was no money.
Yeah, but the people surrounding him, you know.
Well, you had, of course, interest. You had people who. What is quite remarkable, because there was another field where, few weeks before declaring the war, he speaks with a journalist and he said, "You know what will happen if we go into the war? We will destroy all the civil liberty in the country. First Amendment right will be destroyed. It will be a catastrophe." Okay. Then he entered the war and he suppressed. And he has and he did exactly what the horror he announced that would happen if he entered the war. And also, there is one thing he did, under the advice of Walter Lippmann. The day after the declaration, Lippmann wrote a memo saying, you know, until our soldiers are on the ground, it will be difficult to keep the excitement of the American people toward. So you need to organize propaganda. So he organized this 4-minute man, you know, in the cinema. So at that time, in a movie, you needed to get a break, and during 4 minutes, you had a representative of the government who would make speeches in 70,000 places in the country. It was a huge organization of propaganda. It was an incredible. So he organized. He decided, and when you have if you think what Hoover did at that moment and what he rejected in 1930, because he organized the production of agriculture the way I would say a socialist country would, you know, guaranteeing a price, buying all the production, asking. It was an incredible socialized organization that was so. I don't know why I say that, but I say that because yes, you had linked with the business, but it was not only that.
questions, yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. I think I'm one of the few people that's actually read the book by Bullitt and Freud. And I came to it from a completely different direction, trying to discover what was wrong with Karl Schorsky's thesis that Freud was apolitical and psychoanalysis, by extension, was apolitical. And here's Freud writing with Bullitt a very political book.
I agree.
But I would like to know what your thoughts are on the extent to which, on the basis of these new manuscripts, Freud was involved in the actual construction of the book. I know he has a preface, which is quite clear, but I'd be curious to know
I
that.
tell everything about that. He co-wrote completely with Bullitt the general chapter. And let me tell you a story. I tell you. So, so there was a man who was a colleague from Boston, Paul Roazen, who was looking for the manuscript. He was chasing the manuscript. And in 2004, Yale Library called him and said, we have the donation of Bullitt's daughter, and we have an incredible 16-page or 24-page handwritten manuscript of Sigmund Freud. And he got that, and he compared it with a general chapter of the published book, and he says, well, that was what Freud wanted to publish, and Bullitt cut. That was his interpretation. He died without publishing, and it was published by a South African psychoanalyst called Solms, who just revised the general English translation of all the work of Freud. And they say it's a magnificent presentation of the theory of psychoanalysis. It's a Freud's top of its art, etc., etc. So, while working on all these things and all these documents, I can prove in the book, and it's in the book, that this handwritten Freud document was Freud's contribution to the rapid publication of the book in German. Because when he was so happy with the work he has done on the general chapter with Bullitt, he said, I've translated our general chapter, and now it's ready to be publication in German. So it was, this general chapter is it's a co-authorship of Bullitt and Freud, this magnificent. And often, you know, when you work with somebody who is not in the field, you have to be more clear, you have to be more simple, you have to be, so the language is much better than in sometimes, so the general chapter, he co-wrote it, he revised. I have here some, I should distribute that. Here are some, you can circulate that. That's the last page of the manuscript with a different version of work, and that's one page of the general chapter where you can see, you can.
Is that Freud's handwriting on there?
Yes, and Bullitt on some. So you can keep it because I send you a copy.
Okay.
You can keep it for your office. So you have he contributed, and then he read the whole work because Bullitt was introducing in Bullitt brought 500 pages of notes, and then he reduced, etc. He worked 1 year and a half, and then he was reading, and he was correcting, and then he approved, and he signed. I didn't say it. I think he signed every chapter. At the end of each chapter, there is. You have that in the his signature. So he approved on all the chapters. Voilà, exactly.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I was really curious about, you actually just mentioned a sort of sliver of what I was interested in, which is that you said that he didn't, was this Wilson who did not grow up like wealthy, that he...
No, yeah, absolutely.
So I guess I'm interested in more. There was a book that I read that was sort of looking at Mary Trump's biography of the Trump family and talking about how it was one of the best examples she'd seen of like how to bring these sort of family dynamics in an intersection with the sort of political economy of things like inheritance and family wealth. And I guess I'm curious just in terms of like class dynamics and his potential resentments or feelings of superiority that might have come along with that, and the actual like specifics of his or you know, potential windfalls or like destitution that he might have gone into.
I think you have an excellent question, but I think it is a dynamic that comes in the case of Wilson with the fathers, investment, the father. So Wilson learned to speak and to the synonymous. His father bring him in his church, and they are alone, and speech, but he could not read before the age of 9, and he could not write before the age of 11, which is quite late. And in a book that has been written by 2 colleagues, the Georges, which is also a psychological interpretation of Wilson, they emphasize the fact that it was a kind of resistance again here to the father authoritarian pressure to master speeches. There is one thing I didn't say, is that Wilson was always saying, I have a limited mind. I can only think of one thing at the same time. I cannot do whatever, not very rapid. And people who've had a conversation with him say, it's not true at all. He's an extremely rapid mind. He can shift in a private conversation. When it becomes public, when he has to make speeches, the feeling he had that he could think only of one thing, it was because he was, before pronouncing his words, he was checking the father approval. Permanently. So the collapse he had when he accepted the reparation is that the father was not approving. Because Smuts seduced him, but the father was not approving. So you had, he was really traumatized by his father. And I think, I am asked, to debate the book, there was a conference in Amsterdam comparing Trump, Putin, and Wilson. And I said, you know, and I said, I think there is a father issue, there is a humiliation in the youth issue. But for the rest, I never make any other kind of statement when I am asked about other leaders, including my French President Macron. It is because it's really extraordinary to have this material on Wilson. And he was so, he fascinated so much. His strange personality was so an issue that so many people invested. How do you understand him? So you had a lot of people who gave testimony. He was really considered as totally unbalanced. And not because of a stroke, not at all, because of... So that is what I would like perhaps to say. I don't know how much time do we have. We have to stop? Yes. I brought... in 1958, William Longer, who was also an historian of the president of the American Historical Association, gave a very famous speech about the need for historians to include psychoanalysis in their work. And he said, he mentioned, he criticized the tendency on the part of historians to become buried in their own conservative strikes, and he thought it very truly regrettable, what basically may be a virtue trying to become a vice, locking our intellectual faculties in the molds of the past and preventing us from opening new horizons as our cousins in the natural science are constantly doing. And he was telling them they had to open their mind to deep psychology and to psychoanalysis. So in the 70s, you had a tendency of historians to open their mind, and then it stopped. And we were, to the contrary, relying more and more on economics, structural, sociology, etc. But I think the Trump presidency and others brings back the obvious importance of personality. I am going to publish, I'm writing the preface of the memoirs of a general, French general, who was the military chief of staff of Clemenceau between 1917 and the victory of November 18. And I must say, I discover Clemenceau, first of all, the way he ran to victory, and the fact that, because Clemenceau was a young journalist in the United States between the age of 25, so he's not only spoke English perfectly, but he knew the US. I think at some point he wanted to become a US citizen. He said it later. And then when he wanted to have a break and escape French politics, he was going to London. He was knowing very well. He translated John Stuart Mill's, etc. So he knew he has incredible intellectual influence from British. And so you see him. He's a new prime minister. He's never in his office with this general who is very smart. He's going from the US, from Pershing, to the Brit guy, to the French, and say, let's try to coordinate. And you have the role of this guy to face a very strong offensive of the German in the spring of 1918. And as I was telling the publisher earlier today, one person said, we were three of us have won the war. And I could feel that at some point, Roosevelt, Churchill, as persons, were if we didn't have them, we would not be where we are now. And on the other side, we have to re-establish and rethink the role of personality in the social and historical development of our society.
It's a great note to end on.